Hello, my name's Len Schertz. I'd like to tell you a story about the gold mining country of California, where I grew up in. This story was written by a man with the nomenclature Mark Twain. He began his career as Mark Twain in that area in the silver mining country of Nevada as a journalist, and he traveled around that region and collected stories and then wrote them down with a remarkable ability to capture dialect and the certain peculiar form of exaggeration that was prevalent in that culture. So, this story is about one grave and simple Dick Baker, a pocket miner of Dead Horse Gulch. And when Dick Baker was sort of depressed or melancholy, he would tell the people around about a cat that he once owned. Well, let's let him speak for himself. Gentlemen, I used to have a cat by the name of Tom Quartz, which you'd have took an interest in, I reckon. Most anybody would. I had him about 8 years, and he was the remarkablest cat I ever seen. He was a large gray one of the Tom species, and he had more hard natural sense than any man in the camp. The power of dignity. He wouldn't have let the governor of California be familiar with him. He never catched a rat in his life. Appeared to be above it. He never cared for nothing that cat did but mining. He knowed more about mining than any man I ever see. You couldn't tell him nothing about placer diggings. And why? For pocket mining, he was just born for it. He would dig out after Jim and me when we went into the hills prospecting, and he would trot along behind us for as much as 5 miles if he went so far. And he had the best sense of mining ground. Why, you never seen anything like it. When we'd get to work, he'd scatter a glance around the premises, and if he didn't like the prospects, he'd give us a look as much as to say as, well, I'll have to get you to excuse me. And then he would heist his nose in the air and trot off for home. But if the ground suited him, he would lay low and keep dark until the first pan was washed, and then he would sidle up and take a glance in. And if there were 6 or 7 grains of gold in the pan, he was satisfied. He didn't want no better prospect than that. And then he would lay down on our coats and snore like a steamboat until the pocket was struck. And then he would get up and superintend. He was nearly lightning on superintending. Well, by and by, up come this here Quartz excitement. Everybody was into it. Everybody was a picking and a blasting instead of shoveling dirt on the hillside. Everybody was putting down a shaft instead of scraping dirt on the surface. And nothing would do Jim, but we must tackle the ledges ourselves. And so we did. We commenced putting down a shaft. And Tom Quartz, he began to wonder what in the dickens it was all about. He'd never seen mining like that before, and he couldn't come to a right understanding of it. No way. It was too many for him. He was down on it too. You bet you. He was down on it powerful. and always appeared to consider it the cussedest foolishness out. But that cat, he was always again newfangled arrangements. Somehow he could never abide them. You know how it is with old habits. Yeah, but by and by, Tom Quartz began to get sort of reconciled a little, although he never could understand that eternal sinking down of a shaft and never panning out anything. And he began to come down into the shaft himself to try to cipher it out. And when he'd get to feeling the blues and kind of aggravated and disgusted, knowing as he did that the bills was running up all the time and we weren't making a cent, well, he'd lay down in a corner on a gunny sack and go to sleep. Now, one day, when the shaft was down about 8 foot, the rock got so hard that we had to put in a blast. And this was the first blasting we'd done since Tom Quartz was born. Well, we lit the fuse, and we clumb out and got off about 50 yards, and forgot and left Tom Quartz sound asleep on the gunny sack. Well, in about a minute, we seen a puff of smoke bust up out of the air, and then everything let loose with an awful crash, and 4 million tons of rock and rubbish and dirt and smoke and splinters shot off about 1.5 miles in the air. And right smack dab in the center of it was old Tom Quartz, a-going end over end, and a-snorting and a-sneezing and a-reaching and a-clawing for things like all possessed. But it weren't no use. No, sir. It weren't no use. That was the last we seen of him for about 2.5 minutes. Then, all of a sudden, it began to rain rocks and rubbish. Down he come about 10 foot off from where we stood. Kerwop. Well, sir, he was about the orneriest looking beast you ever see. One ear was stove back on his neck, and his tail was all stove up, and his eye winkers was swinged off, and he was all black with smoke and soot and sloppy with mud and slush from one end to the other. It weren't no use to try to apologize. We couldn't say a word. He took a sort of disgusted look at himself, and then he turned around and looked at us, and it was just as much as if he would say, "Gentlemen, maybe you think it's smart to take advantage of a cat that ain't had no experience in quartz mining, but I think different." That he turned on his heels, marched off home, without saying another word. But that was just his style. And you may not believe it, but after that, you never seen a cat so prejudiced against quartz mining as to what he was. You'd have been astonished at his sagacity. The minute we'd touch off a blast and the fuse would begin to sizzle, he'd give us a look as much as to say as, "Well, I have to get you to excuse me." And then it was amazing the way he'd shit up out of that hole and go for a tree. Sagacity. Tain't no name for it. 'Twas inspiration. Thank you. And Merry Christmas.